There's a silent epidemic destroying more potential than poverty, more dreams than failure, more futures than any economic crisis ever could. And you probably have it right now without even knowing it. It's not laziness because you're busy, you're exhausted, you're working hard every single day. It's not lack of desire because you want more. You dream about better. You fantasize about breakthrough. The epidemic is this: you're running at full speed on a treadmill, sweating and tired and convinced you're making progress. But when you stop and look around, you're in the exact same spot you were 12 months ago. You've confused activity with advancement, motion with movement, being busy with actually building something. You're working harder than yesterday, but you're not becoming better than yesterday. And that gap between effort and evolution is where your future goes to die. You know what kills more dreams than failure ever could? It's the exhausting habit of measuring your chapter 1 against someone else's chapter 20. Right now, somewhere in this world, there's a person who woke up this morning and immediately checked what everyone else is doing. They looked at their colleague's promotion, their friend's new house, their classmates' business success, and before they even brushed their teeth, they had already lost the day. They had already convinced themselves they were behind. They had already accepted the lie that their progress doesn't count because it doesn't look like someone else's highlight reel. But here's what I need you to understand today. The moment you start running someone else's race, you abandon your own track. And when you abandon your own track, you lose the one competition you were actually designed to win. Because you were never created to be better than the person next to you. You were created to be better than the person you were yesterday. See, we live in a generation obsessed with comparison. We've turned life into a competitive sport where everyone is constantly looking sideways, checking the scoreboard, with measuring their worth by metrics that have nothing to do with their actual purpose. A young entrepreneur sees another entrepreneur make their first million, and suddenly their own 50,000 in revenue feels like failure. A student scores 85% and feels defeated because someone else scored 92. A father provides for his family but feels inadequate because his neighbor just bought a luxury car. We have confused different timelines with different destinations. We have mistaken someone else's season for our own assignment. Let me tell you about two farmers who lived in neighboring villages. The first farmer, his name was Gabriel. He owned good land, fertile soil, decent rainfall, everything he needed to grow substantial crops. But Gabriel had a problem. Every single morning, he would wake up and walk to the edge of his property. And he would stand there, staring at his neighbor's farm. His neighbor had more land. His neighbor's crops seemed greener. His neighbor's harvest always looked more abundant. So Gabriel would spend his mornings watching, comparing, calculating how far behind he was. Then Gabriel would return to his own field, already defeated, already convinced that his work didn't matter because it would never measure up to what he saw next door. He would plant his seeds half-heartedly. He would water his crops inconsistently. He would skip the hard work of pulling weeds because in his mind, what was the point? He was already losing a race he had created in his imagination year after year. Gabriel's harvest was mediocre, not because his land was bad, not because he lacked resources, but because he was so busy measuring his field against someone else's that he never fully invested in his own. Now, the second farmer. His name was Thomas. He lived 3 villages away. Thomas also had a neighbor with impressive land and abundant crops. But Thomas did something different. Every morning, Thomas would walk his own field. He would examine his soil from yesterday. He would check if it was richer than last week. He would inspect his irrigation channels to see if they were more efficient than last month. He would measure his crop growth against his previous season's records. Thomas kept a journal. In that journal, he didn't write about anyone else. He wrote about himself. What did he learn yesterday? What technique did he improve? What mistake did he correct? Where was his soil healthier than it was 30 days ago? Thomas wasn't competing with his neighbor. Thomas was competing with Thomas. And here's what happened. Year after year, Thomas's harvest grew. Not because he had better land than Gabriel, not because he had more resources, but because every single day, Thomas was committed to one simple principle: be better than yesterday. improve the soil better than yesterday, water more efficiently than yesterday, plant more strategically than yesterday, harvest more wisely than yesterday. 20 years passed. Gabriel was still standing at the edge of his property, still watching his neighbor, and still convinced he was losing. His field never reached its potential because his eyes were never on his own ground. But Thomas had transformed his modest farm into one of the most productive in the entire region. Not because he tried to be the best, but because every day he tried to be better than he was the day before. This is the principle that will change your life if you let it. Your only competition is who you were yesterday, not your brother, not your coworker, not the person who went to school with you and now has the career you wanted, not the influencer with the perfect life on social media, yesterday's version of you. That's your benchmark. That's your measuring stick. That's the only comparison that actually matters. Because when you compete with yourself, something powerful happens. You stop wasting energy on jealousy. You stop losing sleep over someone else's progress. You stop feeling paralyzed by how far ahead everyone else seems to be. Instead, you focus that energy on the one thing you actually have power over, your own growth, your own improvement, your own daily decision to be 1% better than you were 24 hours ago. You know what 1% improvement looks like? It's reading 10 pages instead of scrolling for 30 minutes. It's having a difficult conversation you avoided yesterday. It's saving $20 you would have wasted. It's choosing the healthy meal instead of the convenient one. It's practicing your skill for 15 minutes instead of saying you'll do it tomorrow. It's apologizing when yesterday you would have stayed prideful. It's speaking up when yesterday you stayed silent. These aren't dramatic transformations. They're small victories over yesterday's version of you. But here's the mathematics that will blow your mind. If you improve by just 1% every single day for 1 year, you won't be 1% better. You'll be 37 times better than where you started. 37 times. Not because you compared yourself to anyone else, but because you compounded daily improvements against your own baseline. Now, before you can become better than yesterday, you need to know where yesterday actually left you. And this is where most people stumble. They don't have an honest assessment of their current reality. They're living in a fog of illusions, convinced they're further along than they actually are. Or sometimes, convinced they're more behind than the truth reveals. You cannot improve what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot grow from a position you've never honestly examined. There's a difference between being busy and being productive. There's a difference between activity and accomplishment. There's a difference between motion and actual movement. I see people every single day who are exhausted from running. But when you look closely, they haven't moved an inch from where they stood last year. They're sweating, they're tired, they're stressed. But they're running on a treadmill, not on a track. All that energy, all that effort, and they end up exactly where they started. Why? Because they never stopped to measure their actual starting point. They never created a system to track real growth. They just assumed that because they were tired at the end of the day, they must have made progress. But exhaustion is not the same as evolution. Being drained is not the same as being developed. Let me tell you about a master craftsman who lived in an old city known for its woodwork. This craftsman, his name was Adrian. He was famous throughout the region for creating furniture that would last generations. People would travel days just to apprentice under him. 1 year, 3 young men came to learn his trade. Adrian accepted all 3, each, and he gave them each the same block of wood, the same tools, and the same basic instruction. Create something better each day than what you created the day before. The first apprentice, his name was Nicholas. He was obsessed with what the other apprentices were making. Every evening, he would walk around the workshop comparing his work to theirs. If one apprentice carved a more intricate design, Nicholas would feel discouraged. If the other apprentice finished a piece faster, Nicholas would rush his own work to keep up. Nicholas wasn't measuring his growth. He was measuring his position relative to others. 6 months passed, and Nicholas had created many pieces. But none of them showed any real improvement from his first week. Why? Because he was so busy looking sideways that he never developed his own skill upward. The second apprentice, his name was Peter. He had a different problem. Peter was a perfectionist. He would look at Adrian's masterpieces, furniture that had taken decades of practice to create, and he would measure his beginner's work against a master's lifetime achievement. Every piece Peter made felt like a failure because it didn't match the perfection he saw in Adrian's work. Peter would start a project to get halfway through, see that it wasn't masterpiece quality, and abandon it. He'd start another, encounter the same disappointment, and quit again. Peter wasn't measuring against yesterday's version of himself. He was measuring against an impossible standard that no beginner could reach. After 6 months, Peter had dozens of unfinished projects and a heart full of discouragement. But the third apprentice, his name was Solomon, he did something completely different. On his first day, Solomon carved a simple bowl. It was rough, it was uneven, it had mistakes. But Solomon didn't compare it to Nicholas's bowl or Peter's attempt or Adrian's mastery. Instead, Solomon documented it. He wrote down everything, how long it took, what techniques he used, where he struggled, what he learned. The next day, Solomon carved another bowl. And his only question was this: is this bowl better than yesterday's bowl? Is the curve smoother? Are the edges more even? Did I work more efficiently? Did I learn a new technique? Day after day, day after day, day, week after week, month after month. Solomon kept this practice. He wasn't trying to be the best apprentice in the workshop. He wasn't trying to instantly become Adrian. He was simply trying to be better than the Solomon who held the carving tool yesterday. He kept detailed records. He measured his progress against his own timeline. He celebrated small improvements that no one else would even notice. At the end of 1 year, Adrian gathered all 3 apprentices to examine their progress. Nicholas had created many pieces, but they all looked roughly the same as his first attempts. He had been so distracted by comparison that he never focused on his own development. Peter had great potential, but his workshop corner was filled with abandoned projects. Evidence of a man who quit every time his work didn't match an impossible standard. But Solomon? Solomon's corner told a different story. His pieces were lined up chronologically, and you could see the evolution. The first bowl was rough and amateur, but piece by piece, day by day, there was visible growth. His most recent work wasn't yet at Adrian's level, but it was remarkably better than anything Nicholas or Peter had created. More importantly, it was exponentially better than Solomon's own work from 12 months earlier. Adrian looked at the 3 young men and said something profound. Nicholas, you learned to compare. Peter, you learned to quit. But Solomon, you learned to grow. Nicholas will always be distracted. Peter will always be discouraged. But Solomon will eventually become a master, not because he was the most talented, but because he understood the only measurement that matters: are you better than you were yesterday? This is the truth many people never grasp. Your starting point is yours alone. Your timeline is yours alone. Your pace of growth is yours alone. The only valid question at the end of each day is this: did I improve something, anything, from where I was yesterday? Did I learn something I didn't know yesterday? Did I do something I couldn't do yesterday? Did I overcome something that defeated me yesterday? Did I create something better than I created yesterday? That's the only scoreboard that matters. That's the only competition worth winning. Now, here's what nobody tells you about trying to be better than yesterday. Your greatest enemy in this pursuit isn't external circumstances. It isn't lack of resources. It isn't bad timing or difficult conditions. Your greatest enemy is the version of yourself that's comfortable with where you are right now. That version of you that has adapted to mediocrity. That version of you that has made peace with settling. That version of you that has 1,000 excuses ready for why today can be exactly like yesterday. See, comfort is a silent killer. It doesn't announce itself with drama. It doesn't show up with obvious destruction. It just quietly convinces you that good enough is actually good enough. That adequate is acceptable. That maintaining is the same as progressing. Comfort whispers in your ear, why push yourself today? Yesterday wasn't so bad. Why risk failure trying something new? What you did yesterday worked fine. Why get uncomfortable? Yesterday's approach got you here, didn't it? And that's the trap. Because the moment you stop trying to be better than yesterday, you don't just stay the same, you actually start declining. Nothing in nature stays stagnant. You're either growing or you're dying. You're either sharpening or you're dulling. You're either expanding or you're shrinking. There is no neutral ground. Maintenance is a myth. What you call staying the same is actually slow deterioration, dressed up in familiar clothing. But here's the deeper problem. Your past self doesn't want to die. Every habit you formed yesterday, Every pattern you established, every comfort zone you built, it fights back when you try to change. Your brain has invested energy in becoming yesterday's version of you. It has created neural pathways, established routines, automated behaviors, and now you're asking it to tear all that down and build something new. Your past self will resist. It will sabotage. It will negotiate. It will lie to you about why tomorrow is a better day to start than today. Let me tell you about two brothers who lived in a village suffering from a water shortage. The village was built on rocky terrain, and the nearest river was deep underground. Every family had to dig for their water, and it was hard, exhausting work. These two brothers, their names were Isaac and Jonathan. They both wanted to provide water for their families. Isaac started digging a well in his yard. He dug for 3 days. The ground was hard, his hands blistered, his back ached. On the 4th day, he hit a layer of rock that seemed impossible to break through. So Isaac stopped digging that well. He moved to a different spot in his yard, thinking maybe the ground would be softer there. He dug for another 3 days. Again, difficult soil. Again, hard rock. Again, Isaac stopped and moved to a new location. This pattern continued for months. Isaac was always digging, always working, always exhausted. But Isaac never had water. Why? Because he kept starting over. He would dig until it got difficult, then abandon that hole and start a new one. His yard was full of shallow holes, but not one of them reached water. Jonathan took a different approach. Jonathan picked one spot and made a decision. I will dig here until I reach water, no matter how long it takes. The first day was hard. The second day was harder. By the 4th day, Jonathan hit the same kind of rock that had stopped Isaac. But Jonathan didn't move to a new spot. Jonathan kept digging. He adjusted his technique. He used different tools. He dug at different angles. He took breaks when he needed to. But he always returned to the same hole, the same spot, the same commitment. Some days Jonathan only removed a few handfuls of rock. Some days he felt like he was making no progress at all. But Jonathan understood something Isaac didn't. Depth comes from consistency in one place, not from starting over in many places. After 2 months, Isaac had 20 shallow holes scattered across his property. Jonathan had one deep well, and one morning, Jonathan's tool broke through into an underground spring. Water rushed up, cold and clean and abundant. Not just enough for his family, but enough to share with his neighbors. Isaac looked at his yard full of abandoned attempts and realized he had worked just as hard as Jonathan, sweated just as much, suffered just as many blisters. But Isaac had nothing to show for it because he never stayed in one place long enough to go deep. This is the story of most people's lives. They start digging in their career until it gets difficult. Then they switch careers. They start building a skill until it requires real discipline. Then they switch to a different skill. They start a business until it demands sacrifice. Then they abandon it for a different idea. They commit to a healthy lifestyle until it costs them convenience. Then they go back to old patterns. They're always working, being always busy, always trying, but they never go deep enough in one place to actually strike water. Being better than yesterday requires you to stay in the same hole and dig deeper. It requires you to return to the same commitment even when progress feels invisible. It requires you to push through the rock layer that stops everyone else. Because here's what you need to know. Everyone hits rock. Every single person who pursues growth will encounter that moment where it gets harder, not easier, where the initial excitement fades, and all that's left is the grinding, unglamorous work of showing up again and doing slightly better than you did the day before. The people who win aren't more talented. They're not luckier. They don't have easier circumstances. They just refuse to abandon their well when they hit rock. They understand that the breakthrough is often just beyond the point where most people quit. They know that yesterday's difficulty is preparing them for tomorrow's capacity. They recognize that the resistance they feel isn't a sign they're in the wrong place. It's evidence they're close to the water. So now we come to the practical reality. How do you actually live this? How do you build a life where every day you're genuinely better than the day before? Because understanding the principle is one thing. but implementing it into the chaos of real life. That's where transformation actually happens. You need systems. You need benchmarks. You need a way to measure your progress that's honest, that's consistent. And that keeps you accountable to the one person who matters most, the future version of yourself. First, you need to establish what I call personal benchmarks. These aren't goals borrowed from someone else's vision board. These aren't standards imposed by society or family expectations. These are honest measurements of where you actually are in the areas that matter to your purpose. You cannot be better than yesterday if you don't know what yesterday actually looked like. Most people live their lives in a blur. They can't tell you specifically what they accomplished last Tuesday. They can't identify one concrete way they improved last month. They're moving through life without measurement, and then they wonder why they feel stuck. Take out a piece of paper right now, not later, right now, and write down these areas: your health, your skills, your relationships, your finances, your knowledge, your character. Under each area, write one sentence describing where you are today. Not where you wish you were, not where you think you should be, where you actually are. This is your baseline. This is yesterday. Everything you do from this moment forward gets measured against this honest assessment. Now here's the practice that will change everything. I call it the morning mirror principle. Every single morning, before you do anything else, before you check your phone, before you jump into the demands of the day, you stand in front of a mirror and you ask yourself one question: what is one specific thing I can do today that yesterday's version of me did not do? Not 10 things, not a complete life overhaul. One thing. One specific, measurable, achievable action that represents progress beyond yesterday. Maybe yesterday you woke up at 7 in the morning. Today you wake up at 6:45. That's progress. Maybe yesterday you walked past your family without really seeing them. Today you stop and have a 5-minute conversation with real presence. That's progress. Maybe yesterday you avoided a difficult phone call. Today you make that call. That's progress. Maybe yesterday you spent an hour on social media. Today you spend that hour reading something that develops your mind. That's progress. Maybe yesterday you reacted with anger to criticism. Today you pause and respond with wisdom. That's progress. See, we've been conditioned to think that change has to be dramatic to be real. We think if it's not a complete transformation, it doesn't count. But that's the lie that keeps people stuck. Dramatic change is exciting but rarely sustainable. Small, consistent, daily improvements. So that's what builds an entirely different life. Because improvement compounds. That 1% better today becomes the foundation for 1% better tomorrow. And 6 months from now, you look back and you don't even recognize the person you used to be. But let me be honest with you about something else. There will be days when you fail. There will be mornings when you wake up and you realize that today's version of you was actually worse than yesterday's version. You lost your temper when yesterday you had kept your peace. You wasted time when yesterday you had been productive. You chose comfort when yesterday you had chosen growth. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can let that failure become your new standard, or you can let it become your renewed commitment. This is where most people quit. They have one bad day and they interpret it as evidence that they can't change. They miss one workout and they abandon their health goals. They lose their patience once and they decide they'll never overcome their anger. They make one poor financial decision and they give up on building wealth. But here's what mature people understand. Failing to be better than yesterday doesn't erase all the days you succeeded. It just means tomorrow you have a clear target again. When you fail, you don't start over. You just recalibrate. You examine what happened. You identify what triggered the regression. You adjust your approach. You learn from it. And then tomorrow, you simply try again to be better than today's failure. Because even a day where you learn why you failed is better than a day where you learn nothing at all. Let me paint you a picture of what happens when you commit to this lifestyle. 1 year from today, you won't just be 365 small improvements better. You'll be exponentially different. Your thinking will be sharper because you fed your mind every day instead of starving it. Your relationships will be deeper because you invested in them consistently instead of neglecting them. Your skills will be more refined because you practice them daily instead of occasionally. Your character will be stronger because you chose integrity in small moments instead of compromising. Your health will be more vibrant because you made better choices meal by meal, day by day. And here's the beautiful part. While everyone else was distracted, comparing themselves to others, measuring their worth by external standards, exhausting themselves, trying to keep up with people running completely different races, you were quietly, consistently, relentlessly competing with the only person who matters. You were beating yesterday's version of yourself. And that compounding effect, that daily dedication to incremental improvement, it creates a life that most people only dream about but never build. Your tomorrow is being constructed by your today. Every decision you make right now is either building the future you want or repeating the past you're trying to leave behind. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to transform overnight. You just need to be better than you were yesterday. That's it. That's the assignment. That's the only competition worth winning. And if you commit to that simple principle, if you wake up every single day and ask yourself how you can improve by just 1%, I promise you, your life will never be the same.